Drum machines have a tendency of churning out robotic-sounding drum patterns, which is no surprise given that the tools at our disposal are cute little robots. I've been a long-time fan of smashing real drums ever since the first time I played them some 20 years ago. But the limitations of space and time have forced me to get creative with my drum recordings over the years. So our goal today is getting this little drum machine sounding as close as possible to a real drum kit, to the point of fooling casual listeners and perhaps even a music producer or two. And we're gonna pull that off by using the right samples and applying processing to each of the samples to make sure they play well together as a cohesive drum kit. Next, we'll look at humanizing the time and velocity parameters to make the pattern sound more human. At the end, I'll share my pro tip on how I use my other gear to get more out of this little thingy. Let's go. A drum machine cannot replace the timing, dynamics, and creative outbursts that a flesh and bone drum lunatic is prone to exhibiting. However, sample replacement on recorded drums is a very common mixing technique that's used in many genres of music today. This is when you layer or completely replace certain drum sounds, such as the kick and the snare, with either pre-recorded or synthesized drum samples. Reasons for doing so usually include dealing with a poorly recorded drum track or the desire to tighten up the mix and make sure those drums are punching through at consistent volumes and in the right frequency range. So instead of recording an actual drum kit and then replacing the drum hits in a DAW, why don't we go the other way around and simply record the whole drum track using pre-recorded drum samples from the start? That sounds a lot less painful than trying to mic up an entire real drum kit. The first thing we need to decide is which instruments we're going to use in our kit. And right off the bat, we're forced to deal with the limitations of having only 6 tracks. Now, this is not a deal breaker, it's simply an invitation for us to get creative. The default drum kit I'm running will usually include the following: kick, snare, ride, crash, closed hat, and open hat. Pro tip: group the O and C hats together. And I find these are all the tracks that I really need during the initial composition of a track. But once I start getting closer to the finish line, I like having 2 different drum kits at my disposal to add variety across different sections of the track. So let's say one kit will have a kick, snare, left and right crash, open and closed hi-hat. And the other kit will have a kick, snare, left and right crash, but a ride cymbal and a ride bell hit. And you can use a similar approach if you were to add toms, other cymbals, or other instruments, such as the notorious cowbell. This may sound tedious, but once you've got your kits ready, switching between them is dead easy. Once we've decided which instruments we'll need for each section of our song, it's time to select the actual samples. The samples I'm using are recordings of one-shot hits from real drum kits that I've collected over the years and somewhat processed. And you can download this sample pack for free. I've put the link down in the description. On one hand, it's a shame underutilizing the capabilities of this drum machine by not using the excellent ACB and FM drum synths. On the other hand, I don't give a shit. Just give me some acoustic drums. Once we've selected the samples, it's time to dive into the menus and tweak each sound until they start playing well together. First we're going to look at is tune. And you're most likely going to want to tune it within the song itself to see how it plays with everything else. And of course, each of these tracks has its own set of effects. So let's say I want to bump up the transient on this snare here. And we can do this for each track individually. Now let's give this whole kit a darkroom reverb. So I'm going to use room as the type. First, let's make sure that we have some reverb on the snare. Sounds about right. With the level halfway. Pre-delay at 20 milliseconds, which is fine, I think, for a room reverb. We'll give it a low cut at 160, so the bass and everything else is not interfering with the rest of the mix. And I'm keeping the high cut at around 4K because I don't want too much splashiness in the drum mix. And as a final touch, I'll drop some distortion on the Master FX. This may sound ludicrous to people who are using a DAW, because they can just record each track separately over USB and spend the next few nights trying to get their drum mix down sounding just right. But getting our sounds right is just the first step. What's really going to make this drum kit sound really real are tiny little variations in volume and timing. So we got a new pattern going here. First thing we can do is add some swing or shuffle to it. A quick way of adding ghost notes is going into TR-rec, selecting the instrument, and when we're holding shift, we'll press down where we want the ghost notes added. But if we want more control, we can actually hold down the note and then select the velocity we want for each note. And if we want to get even more creative, we can change the decay and the tune per step as well. And as you can see, there are a couple of options we can change for each of the steps. And there's also a dedicated sub-step menu, which is good for flams or quick fills. One thing I find quite limited on the TR-6S is the LFO. While you can use it per track to change different parameters, the whole LFO is global, so there's not a lot of options you can do for each of the tracks in terms of timing, and there's also no randomization in the LFO or sample and hold feature, which would then apply a random number to each of the steps within a set range. However, if you're using a more powerful sequencer to control the TR-6S, there's a lot more you'll be able to get out of it. In my case, I'm using the Digitone keys as my master sequencer. And here's what I like to do with it when I'm sending MIDI to my drummer. So the first thing I like to do is play with microtiming on the Electron sequencer. And we can move each of these notes a little bit off the grid. And we can also use the Digitone's internal LFO to change the parameters on the TR-6S. So you first have to check out the MIDI implementation on the TR-6S and then match those parameters on the Digitone's MIDI settings page. So the CC value I've got set on here is MIDI CC29, which I believe is the volume for the snare, which corresponds to this encoder here. So let's see how that works. Yeah, that sounds about right. And so I can do an LFO on that. So I've got sample and hold, random parameters going on value 8, and we can give it a pretty big depth and then go down from there. And of course we can use the good old electron sequencer for each of these trigs and set the velocity that we're sending to the TR-6S. This is just a quick example to show you what the electron sequencer is capable of doing when sending MIDI notes to an external drum machine. Most electron devices can do the same, including the Digitact, Syntact, Octatrack, but also other powerful sequencers and even drum pads. Check out my other video for a deep dive into my DAWLESS setup and see how the TR-6S fits into that workflow. Or if you want to get straight into programming some drums, then get my free drum sample pack from the description and subscribe for more gear reviews, production tips, and DAWLESS adventures.